Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Can you please rise for the presentation of colors presented by the Sarasota County Fire Department Honor Guard. Thank you.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I particularly want to thank the Sarasota firefighters for presenting the colors. And I want to invite you on their behalf this Saturday. They're having a benevolent fund is inviting the public to a September 11th 10-year anniversary memorial march on Main Street in Sarasota, 10:30 Saturday morning, to remember those who lost their lives and to honor this area's first responders. Following the march, the public is invited to a celebration at Payne Park. So with our deep thanks for your coming, they're on duty and they actually have to go back to work. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you so much for presenting the colors. Please be seated. Dr. Guilford.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Arthur Guilford, Regional Chancellor of University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. And I'd like to thank all of our panelists personally for coming here today. And I'd like, if there are any elected officials here or their representatives, to please stand up so we can acknowledge you. We didn't have a complete list. Good. Thank you very much for being here today. And with that, I would also like to thank all first responders for being here today. We certainly do appreciate it. And with that, I will turn the program over to Dr. Judy Sedgman, who will introduce our panelists and will lead the discussion. Judy?
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I really, really appreciate your coming out in the rain and joining us for this beautiful opportunity to pay tribute to the resilience of the human spirit. Because indeed, after 10 years of one of the worst occurrences, certainly in our lifetime and in our memory, it is an astonishing thing to see the recovery and the resilience that so many people who were touched by this event have experienced, and yet how our lives have been deeply changed. I'm very, very grateful to our panel. They will introduce themselves more when they have a chance to speak. And if you've read the program, then you know what their particular point is. I'm going to introduce them one at a time. Each panelist, for the purpose of this program, each panelist will have about 7 minutes to tell what they want to share with you. And then we want to preserve time at the end for members of the audience to speak. I'd like to suggest, if you would, because this is being filmed for METV, and our deep thanks to Charles Clapsaddle for coming to do that, when you choose to speak, please don't speak from the audience, because number one, we won't be able to hear you, but number two, he won't be able to see you. So as I ask the audience to share or speak or ask questions, and please feel free to ask questions of the panelists. Please go to that podium where the mic will be live and speak into the microphone. And I'm also going to ask if you've come to share that you observe the 2-minute rule so that everyone will have a chance to speak. So please, try to condense. I know it's difficult for some people. This is a very emotional remembrance, and people have a lot to say, but try to keep it brief so that other people can share as well. So we're going to start our journey through the triumph over this tragedy with Dan Hoff.
All right. Thank you all for coming today. I actually was living in Sarasota and actually was sent up to the Trade Center for training. And it was actually our second day of training on 9/11. And I was on the 61st floor of the South Tower that was facing the North Tower. When the first plane hit, we were actually on a break. And you heard an explosion, and it actually cracked windows all the way down to where we were. And I'll tell you, when that happens and you're in a high-rise building, 110 floors, and you're up on the 61st floor, time kind of slows down and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And I remember looking up in the sky and seeing all these documents pouring out of the sky. And it looked like a ticker tape parade, and you could see smoke, and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And I remember walking over to the window and looking down and seeing fire and burning debris beneath me. And that's when our fire alarm went off, and they told everybody to get your personal stuff and head to the stairwells. And I said, forget my personal stuff, left the briefcase, left everything. But must have been in shock, because going to the stairwell, I still had my cup of coffee, and someone's like, hey, what are you doing with that? So I had to put that down. But I don't know if any of you have been in the Trade Center, but the stairwells were not very wide. You could only fit 3 people across. And as everybody started to head down, people kept coming in, and you kind of got jammed up, and you kept getting more and more crowded. And the PA was trying to tell us something, and by about, I think it was right around the 10th floor, we finally stopped and hushed, and we heard over the PA that World Trade Center 1 was hit and 2 was secure. And we were in 2, and I remember thinking, thank God we're in 2. And literally, it was very ironic, because literally it seemed like 5 or 10 seconds after that, that's when the second plane hit us. And I'll tell you, when that hit us, my first thought was I almost made it. You almost thought the building was just going to go over. Jet fuel went down the HVAC or elevator shaft, blowing out beneath us. The lights went out, but I guess in '93, they never came back on, but thankfully they did something to make sure the lights came back on, because a lot more people wouldn't have made it out if that hadn't happened. And then to put yourself in the scenario, you're kind of crammed in there, you can't move. Smoke's coming up from below, and the stairwell you're in is swaying. And you kind of lose all sense of time, and I remember just focusing on getting to the 9th floor, and you're like, thank God it hasn't fallen yet. And you keep heading down into this smoke, and you're hot, and I remember covering up, trying to not get too much smoke. And I'll never forget, we got to the mall level underneath the Trade Center, and that's where there was this World Trade Center maintenance worker. And this guy is covered in dust and soot, and his eyes look like cue balls, and he almost was so scared he couldn't speak, but yet he's holding the door open so we can all get out and escape into the mall. And I do not know what happened to him, but I hope he was able to get out. And as we're coming down, sort of getting out in the mall, that's where we saw the true heroes of 9/11, the firefighters. And they're going up, and I'll tell you what, you really had to appreciate the bravery to understand the courage of the firefighters and the first responders and everybody going up trying to rescue people, and all we're trying to do as survivors is just escape and get out. And I mean, I'll never forget the bravery of those guys. That's, for me, the real reason to speak is to share and make sure we never forget who the true heroes are. I mean, survivors, we're fortunate. It didn't seem like there was any rhyme or reason. I've talked to lots of folks, and unfortunately, too many good people died that day. I remember in the mall level, we actually were able to, they were keeping people underground and bringing them up subways further away because of debris falling. But having been trapped in the stairwell, there was a guy next to me. And whoever was next to you when this hit, we kind of formed a team. And he and I were bonded, and we were going to get out. And when we got down, after having been trapped the whole time, we saw another huge line, and then we saw nothing this way. And so we took off this way. And fortunately, where we came out on the street level, no one was, there were no debris falling and no one jumping, which we were very fortunate. And we got out, and once I had blue sky above me, then I felt happy. We started to walk, and I remember seeing all these crowds across the street pointing, screaming, crying, and that's when I turned around and looked up, and you saw the flames licking up the side, and it was this picture-perfect blue sky. And you thought, this can't be happening, and if it is happening, it can't be happening to me. You always think it's going to happen to somebody else, but let me tell you, unfortunately, it does happen to everybody. And we got out, and I'll never forget, best decision of my entire life, I was with a group of people, and they were like, let's stay and watch. And I was like, watch? I said, we can always see it on the news. We are heading uptown. And as we walked away, we were kind of going against the flow of traffic, because a lot of people were trying to get closer to see what was happening. And fortunately, we did walk away because, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes after we got out, it actually came down. And imagine, the crazy thing what people don't understand is if you were actually there, we knew less about what was going on than pretty much everybody else in the world. And I remember we'd walked a good ways away, and we're still trying to figure out what's happening. And I went up to this utility worker's truck. And as we're walking away, I mean, every siren you can imagine, ATF, Port Authority, FBI, I mean, everybody was flying down trying to save people. And I get to this utility worker truck, and as I'm talking to these guys, they're saying it's terrorists. We saw the first plane hit, and they're explaining it to me, and then we hear over the radio the Pentagon was hit. And I remember thinking, what am I, in a Tom Clancy novel? I mean, it just didn't make any sense. It was unbelievable. Imagine New York City where there were no cars, no buses, no subways. You could only walk, and as you're walking away, eventually there was an F-16 circling the city to protect us. And I guess the key point I want to make sure we never forget the bravery of the firefighters, and that we never forget all the good people who passed away that day. Because I have this sort of feeling like once you forget something, that's when something could happen again. And I'm very thankful that there have been no other major terrorist attacks so far. Now, when we got back to Sarasota, we gave about 100 talks and raised funds for the New York firefighters. And then the nice thing is, I don't know where Jay Riley is, but Jay and I helped out with Triumph Over Tragedy in 2002, and we were able to raise roughly 100 grand and bought 10 Jaws of Life for the Sarasota firefighters, which was pretty neat. But when we went around giving these talks, I came across a poem, and I wanted to share it with you, and then I'll end with that. But it was kind of a moving poem, and it seemed to touch a lot of people, and it goes, I read of a reverend who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on her tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of her birth and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time that she spent alive on earth. And now only those who love her know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left. You could be a dash mid-range. If we could just slow down enough to consider what's true and real, and always try to understand what other people feel, and be less quick to anger, and show appreciation more, and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect, and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy's being read, with your life's actions to rehash, will you be proud of the things they say about how you spent your dash? Thank you.
Well, go ahead. I was going to. No, go ahead. Well, then we're going to hear from Jackie Barron, and I think it's interesting because her story is parallel to Dan's. While he was in the building, she was watching President Bush read My Pet Goat.
Well, that's right. Well, extraordinary, ordinary individuals like Dan are what have defined my existence as a journalist, and I say that with all the pride in the world, that I get to know and tell the stories of people like Dan, and being part of the story is very unusual, but that's exactly what happened for me that day. Is I was assigned to cover President Bush. He was supposed to come to launch a reading initiative. It was a fluff, featurey story. The president was here. That's always a big deal. And this area is no stranger to presidential visits or potential presidential visits. And so what goes with an assignment like that is you have to arrive very early. There's exhaustive security checks. You have to arrive hours ahead of time. Then they divide you. There is what they call a pool situation. So a few photographers, usually one still, one broadcast, one reporter from each medium, were assigned to the pool. They represent the larger group. They went in with the president while he read the storybook. And then I was assigned to the media center with the larger group of us and a large contingent of Secret Service agents. And you had to be sort of ushered in there after you were checked with the bomb-sniffing dogs and so on and so forth, well ahead of time. So as you can imagine, we're all sort of crowded in there, and we're just sort of sitting in there passing the time. And then all of a sudden, my phone rang, which it was not supposed to, but of course, timing being everything, it was my mother, who always seems to call at just the right moment. And they had just finished lecturing us on no using your cell phones, and there's Mom. And so I answer, because you don't ever not answer your mother's phone call. And I asked her, I told Mom, I can't talk. And she said, Jackie, on the Today Show today, Matt Lauer just said a plane flew into the World Trade Center. I said, well, what, some small plane? I mean, no one could fathom. So, right, it was like a domino effect. As I hung up my phone, the phone started lighting up. And one of the things that sticks with me most is there had been a particular Secret Service agent who was sort of assigned to my area of the room. She was a female. She was very kind, but all business. And a few moments later, she becomes very emotional, almost panicked. And come to find out, at this point now, obviously the presidential speech has been delayed. We're waiting much longer. We're trying to figure out what is happening. There were a few television sets around the room within the media center that everyone's trying to clamor around to find out what's going on, because in many ways we were cut off from the information flow. Back then there wasn't quite the BlackBerries and the iPhones. You couldn't pull it all up. It was just a regular old cell phone, and they didn't want you using them. And so I went up to her and I said, what's wrong? And she said, my husband works at the Pentagon, and a plane has just flown into the Pentagon. And it was really surreal. I think that's the word we were looking for earlier. I mean, even to this day, as I discuss it, it almost seems like an out-of-body experience to have been there. And so there was almost like this stunned, shocked silence as the president entered the room, because you couldn't fathom what he could possibly say at that moment. And at the same time, that you were there as he addressed the country for the first time in our darkest hour. And his words were short and brief. It wasn't so much what he said, but the look upon his face that stays with me, equal parts anguish and anger and fear on the face of our leader, just like the rest of us in the room. What did it mean? And then it occurred to me that I was sitting in the room with the president, and there were children in classrooms a stone's throw away, and was this safe? And about that time, they ushered him out, and he was not there very long. And I spent the next 12 to 15 hours reporting on that 5-6 minute speech that he gave that day addressing the country. And I assumed that that would be it for me. I mean, I was in beachy Sarasota. What more could this area possibly, how more could we be tied into the story of the day? And I told my mother, who was staying with me on Siesta Key at the time, I told her, well, I'll be home, and then they probably won't even call me in tomorrow. And about 5 o'clock in the morning, my phone rang that the terrorists had trained in Venice and to head to Huffman Aviation. Needless to say, for the weeks and months to come, that was the only story I did. We were here in Sarasota immersed as much in the center of it as you could be, short of being in New York, it seemed. And I was able to interview and tell the stories not only of those terrorists that were here and the not so good things that occurred here in our backyards, but also our very neighbors like Dan and Alan Silva, who still lives here, and another gentleman who was in New York in the World Trade Center at the time, who has since moved back to Canada, and several firefighters from this area who literally got in their cars and took vacation and drove until they reached there and did whatever they could. even as recently as about a year or so ago, another firefighter who now splits his time between New York and Sarasota, who was forced to retire, whose whole family, as you might imagine, in New York, belonged to the fire department, and he was forced to retire at a young age because he can't hardly breathe because of what he inhaled for the months that he spent at Ground Zero, doing recovery, not rescue, as we all know. And so I feel blessed not to have been in the presence of the president that morning or that afternoon so much, but for the opportunity to have met individuals like Dan and others that really define, I believe, who we are as a country. The resilience that Judy mentioned, the true American grit, if you will, that really tells so much about who we are and what we're capable of, and that we can rise up literally from those ashes and be as great and as strong and as powerful as we were, just smarter and hopefully not as vulnerable, even though I think that's a yo-yo there, but just as powerful in terms of character. I remember that time there were girlfriends of mine who we were about the age that a lot of us were starting to have families, wondering if they should have children in this age of fear and danger. And needless to say, they have all gone on to have children. I have 2 of my own. But it's just the mindset, and I think that stays with you a little bit, not just how fearful you felt, but how angry and now how determined to not only move past it, but be better because of it. And so I always feel sort of honored and blessed to have been the one who could share those stories. It's always a challenge because there's never enough time in the day to tell you all that I wanted to tell you. I am no longer a reporter. I have made a career change, but it was a rewarding career, and I'm glad to have been part of that time in American history and to have known all these wonderful individuals.
Well, as we go on with the story and see the many lives that were touched by this event, we're going to hear from Luke Bensey, whose entire career took an immediate turn.
Thank you. My experience with September 11th actually deals with the response, both the immediate response that took place on September 12th, as well as the ongoing 10 years that we've had in this war on terror. My career did change with a phone call, basically, on September 12th. Just to give you a little backstory, I was previously worked in Sarasota. I had gone up to Washington, D.C. to get a master's in national security studies. I wrote my thesis. This is all before 9/11. I wrote my thesis on Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and the connections with the Taliban. And I had, while I had graduated in 99, 2000, I had shotgunned my resume to every 3-letter government agency up in Washington, D.C., every defense contractor. I was ready to go to work in this counterterrorism thing. But as you know, before September 11th, it wasn't on people's minds as it is now. There were attacks before by al-Qaeda. I mean, they weren't an unknown organization. They had attacked us in '93 at the World Trade Center. In '98, there was the East Africa bombings. In '96, bin Laden actually made the fatwa to declare attacks against the United States. And then in 2000, we had the USS Cole bombing. So it wasn't new, but again, it wasn't top of mind. I ended up coming down to Florida, working in Miami with the Bioterrorism Center down at the Health Department in Miami, which actually turned out to be the group that picked up the anthrax when we had the first anthrax attacks a few months later at the AMI building in South Florida. So I was in Sarasota visiting my family on September 11th, was watching Matt Lauer with my father having coffee, and we saw the second plane hit the tower. And like everyone, was horrified, was shocked, was surreal moment. He couldn't believe it was happening. Couldn't believe that President Bush was here in Sarasota. But then something happened. On September 12th, the phone rang. And it was one of those places up in Washington that I had previously sent resumes to. And they said, hey, we need you up here. Can you get on the planes as soon as airplanes start flying? Come up. We've got a 30-day project we'd like you to work on. We can't tell you about it. Just get on a plane and come up here. So on September 14th, when planes started to fly, I went up to D.C. and actually started working for the State Department up there on a project that they had was 30 days, could terrorists do a second wave of attacks? And at the time, it was Ebola. That was the big, that was the African virus that, you would bleed out, coagulate. They were worried. And I'm not a scientist. My expertise was, could people smuggle things? That's what they had me assigned to. So about 10 days into the job, my supervisor tapped me on the shoulder and says, hey, you're not going home after 30 days. And I've never been back. I've lived in Washington 10 years on. But from there, I transferred over to the State Department's Foreign Emergency Support Team, the FES team, which is basically a collection of different agencies throughout the U.S. government that if there is a attack, something against Americans internationally, we would be on a pager 24 hours, and we'd have to get to Andrews Air Force Base, load up on the plane, and it was us, it was FBI, it was Department of Energy, hostage negotiators, you name it, and we'd all load up within 3 hours, and we'd have to fly out and start the initial triage, or basically do the initial investigations on whatever the terrorist attack might have been. So I remember one of my first trips out was to Amman, Jordan, after the triple suicide bombing attacks out there. And again, here they are, 3 American hotels with suicide attacks. And I don't know how many of you travel internationally, but if you notice, if you do travel internationally to a lot of hotels around the world, they have the full security. We have been very lucky in this country that we don't have, when we go to a restaurant, a metal detector, a pat-down when we go to a restaurant or a shopping mall. Or into hotels. This exists in the rest of the world. Fortunately, very fortunately, we have not experienced this yet in the United States. So with that, I continued to travel with the State Department. In fact, I think I did about 85, 90 countries traveling around doing these kinds of surveys, doing investigations. My total country count now is about 120 countries, but have spent numerous times in Iraq, numerous times in Afghanistan. And really, over the last 10 years, there's some things that I've taken away from my experiences of seeing everything that we've done as a country as far as giving a coordinated response to the attacks that happens. Number one, it is great that there has been no other attacks out there. I mean, certainly there are a lot of people working very hard at all times to prevent any of this from happening again. And we certainly are more vigilant, not just as a government, but certainly as individual people with things that we notice nowadays. I think we're not as oblivious sometimes to maybe the things that we see in our day-to-day lives, even here in the United States. So the real observations that I've kind of taken from that is, number one, with the recent killing of Osama bin Laden, yes, it was very important that that happened. That doesn't necessarily bring an end to the war on terror. The threat will exist and persist probably for all of us in our lifetimes. But the good news is for the people that, for the families that lost loved ones, and not just in the Trade Center. I mean, certainly there's been a lot of lives have been lost both in overseas in the wars and terrorist attacks, not just military, but the diplomatic corps, the intelligence community, the defense contractors. All these folks have lost their life as well. So it was a nice bookend, you can say, for September 11th. But again, the threat will always persist. That's sort of observation number one that I took away. Number two is one thing that's really made me proud as an American is that being overseas, seeing so many young people, and we always hear about, oh, young people today, they're not like the older generations. They don't work as hard, they're lazy, they're whatever, they're spoiled. No. If you go overseas and you see the young people, guys and gals who are 19, 20 years old, the tremendous responsibility that they are given, whether it be to guard a post, whatever it is, I mean, it's tremendous. And going out on the roads at night with roads with IEDs, and they're 19 and 20 and doing this, it's really impressive. And you see that these are going to be the future leaders. These are the guys who are going to come back. They're very thick-skinned, and they're going to be the future business leaders and entrepreneurs. So that was a very nice takeaway to see that, how impressive our young people actually are as well. And then I think just finally, just a last thought is that we have been lucky. Luck plays a big part of staying safe against terrorist attacks. Sometimes we stumble onto some things. Other times it's good information. Sometimes the bad guys get sloppy. But we always hear the old analogy that, we have to be, the bad guys only have to be right once. We have to be right 100% of the time, and that's really true. But again, I think there's some outstanding people out there working very hard, very dedicated, and I think it's a credit to our country what we've been able to do since September 11th. And my only fear, and again, is I just hope that we don't live in a world that one day 9/11 becomes a footnote in a history book saying that something bigger has happened, that 9/11 doesn't become as grand of an attack as it actually was. We hope that we never go above that at all. So, thank you.
Well, we now turn to Kuwait and what was a modest presence in Kuwait, and hear the story from Sergeant Chris Wenzel.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending. I'm going to break mine up into about 3 sections. On 9/11, the attacks unfolded a little different for me and my family. They occurred in the afternoon because we were 6 hours ahead. We were living in England at the time. We just finished a training session on search and recovery, and we were breaking for lunch when the stories unfolded that something had hit the Trade Center. We only have one television station, and it was coming from the British, so it was, our news was a little slow, and it wasn't priority like probably it was here in the States. So as it's already late in the afternoon, things were unfolding, the directives came down and said, you're shutting your base down, you're locking it, everybody stays where they're at. So we had to spin into a whole different momentum of sustainment. So not only are we taking care of our military folks, but everybody that's kind of locked on the base because they won't let anybody come and go. So it's normally about 2,500 people, probably is now about 3,000, 3,200. So you're feeding, you're housing, you're trying to figure out how you're going to support all these folks. So this went on for about 2 days as we were trying to figure out what was going on. The gates slowly opened, people were coming and going. But the mission was really uncertain at that point in time. Having lived through some of the other terrorist attacks, the USS Cole that happened a few years prior to that, you're kind of used to it as a service member, the base going into lockdown or shutdown, security heightens, the whole thing. You just don't know how long it's going to go on. Well, with what we were seeing unfold from 9/11, we knew something was going to happen, and we were trying to come up with how we were going to tackle anything that may come our way. The week or so after 9/11, there was a lot of what-ifs. There was a lot of mission planning. Where would we go? Who would we go with? How long would we be gone? What do we need to take? So we were trying to come up with options and plans so at least we could lean forward and be prepared for whatever actions may come down. I was a deployment NCO for our squadron. We did receive a phone call saying we were sending the first 12-person team out as soon as airflow was available. So we spent about a week getting them together and trying to get them situated and trying to get them out, because really nothing was really flying, even overseas. It was very hard to get airflow to where you needed to go. So the day that I stuck them on a plane finally and shoved them out the door, I get another phone call saying you need to send another 10-person team. Unfortunately, our squadron was really tapped at that point in time, and I was part of that 10-person team that went out. We were grabbing whoever was left because we had just had a team come back from a 3-month deployment. So we were kind of stretched kind of thin, so we grabbed who we could. Unfortunately, or fortunately, our rotation went a little bit quicker. We were gone within about 72 hours. So ours was a really quick turnaround time, which kind of leads me into, the last stage of where we're going is arriving in the Mideast. You're meeting up with folks from all over the world. We had folks from Japan that were transiting it with us, quite a few from the States that were transiting with us. But we were one of the first boots on the ground to establish a forward presence in a foreign country to prepare for what lays ahead. Trying to figure out where your base is going to go and how you're going to support, which was initially about 200 people, which grew to our strength was supposed to be about 1,200. How you're going to do this, where you're going to put your camp. You know, we've just got a big, literally a desert with a runway, and you've got to figure out, work with the engineers and how everything is going to be situated. You know, you got to pitch your own tent before you can sleep tonight. You're still eating MREs, how we're going to get food in, how we're going to get lodging available. You know, how are we going to support all these troops that are transiting it through and eventually will be here to our base. You know, security, there's a whole bunch that played in. And during this whole time, this is just about a month after 9/11, we're literally in the dark about what's going on back in the States. So while you guys are being fed news 24/7 about what's going on, you know, we don't have television, we don't really have radio, we get an English language newspaper delivered, but it didn't really cover a whole lot on 9/11. You know, we knew what had happened, and we, as bad as the rest of the world, wanted to go in and just, you know, settle the score and correct everything. But we were in the dark a lot of times about what was going on. You know, we didn't know really what the casualty counts were. We're hearing stories like you've heard here today at the table, just kind of run through as news articles. But again, our main mission was to support our troops as they came through going forward and to support our folks that we had. Eventually, we would grow to a camp of about 1,200, but from the ground up, we had to get, you know, food service contracts, we had to get laundry contracts, you know, fitness, recreation. You've got the engineers trying to build more latrines and get tents in, and anything you need to actually build a city in no time at all. About halfway through our stay, we did have one of the first terrorist attacks on our compound, and a little earlier than that, we did suffer the first American casualty of Enduring Freedom. So we were very active. We were trying to be proactive. You know, as we were saying, any loss of life is regrettable, but you've really got to step back and look and think where you're at and where you're going, and are we doing the best we can? And we pulled together. We made things happen that, you know, I'm still amazed about at this point in time. The whole thing really unfolded and how it came together. We did rotate out about 6 months later. I know my time is running short, but I did turn back around 6 months later to go back again. So I do have 2 tours after 9/11. The second tour did turn into Iraqi freedom, so I rolled from one into the other one. Very familiar with war planning and how the whole thing comes together. And a lot of our expertise was used because as a country, we really hadn't been in this type of situation since Vietnam. And even the way we act now and react is a whole lot different. The technology is just so technically advanced and changing every day that we were pulled a lot even as we were going into Iraq saying, what do we need to do? How can we do this? And we look back on what we did after 9/11 to make sure that we did have a valid process in place that would ensure safety of our folks on the ground and in the air, and to get us from point A to point B in a safe and expedient manner.
I think that was a reminder of how many small details make up a large effort sometimes we in the public know the generalities, but we don't know what goes into every moment of every day for people that are involved. And certainly one of the most touching stories that I've heard about that is our last speaker, Bonnie Silvestri, who is a part of the Institute for Public Policy and Leadership and is taking a different role to share with us what she did in New York as an attorney to help the survivors get their due process. So, Bonnie.
Thank you. I'm hearing so many different themes being repeated that really resonate with me. So I thought that I would kind of express a lot of the different emotions that I was feeling. I lived in Manhattan, and like Dan, I was sort of thinking about the last time that he experienced being in the World Trade Center, and there's that loss as well, that the World Trade Center no longer exists. So I was thinking he was one of the last people to actually be inside. And the night before 9/11, on September 10th, I was actually invited to an alumni event at a law firm that was overlooking the World Trade Center, and I recall that the invitation was very specific about the beautiful views of the World Trade Center. So it was I was there till about 9 or 9:30 that night, and sort of that was my last view of the World Trade Center until the next morning, where I had to get up and go to work. And I heard Matt Lauer also, but for some reason, his saying that a plane hit the World Trade Center, I assumed it was a tiny commuter plane, and I didn't really give it a lot of thought and just headed to work. And I arrived at Chambers Street subway station, which is the station I always went to for my work at Lafayette Street, across from the courthouse that many people see on television all the time. And I saw that the towers were burning and was just shocked and saw so many people taking pictures, which kind of resonated with what Dan said, that I found that kind of just disturbing and garish, because I was thinking of the people that must be in the buildings, and I wasn't quite sure what to do next, whether to go to my office or not. But fortunately, a person like Dan came running past me and said he had just come from the building and that it was important to evacuate the area as quickly as possible. So I started walking home, and there's a lot that I could tell you about that and all the people that I met along that journey that were so kind, because it is kind of scary to be walking home by yourself and have no idea really what's going on. And I actually heard someone shout out, "The Supreme Court just blew up," and there was a lot of sort of misinformation. So I think that the theme that Jackie was talking about too, and others have said, that you were without information. So in some ways, I almost felt grateful that I was busy walking and trying to get home instead of watching all of what was transpiring on the television, because I also was fortunate not to see anyone falling from the building or something like that. I know that would have been really difficult for me. So I just basically was focused on getting home. And then your comment about seeing blue sky. When I got to Central Park, I just felt just a huge weight had been lifted off of me, because I knew I was almost home, and I knew that I had arrived, and that seeing nature, I think, was really important on that day as well. And I just was so overwhelmed with emotion, because I started to learn what was happening, and I recall finding a friend, and we sat out on the porch of my building waiting for everyone to come home who lived in my building. I lived in this great building where I knew so many of my neighbors, and I just wanted to see everyone walk through the door. And fortunately, everyone from my building did survive, and we experienced this together, and it was just kind of like a family there on 69th Street near Central Park. And shortly thereafter, because I worked for New York City government, I assumed I would be reassigned in some sort of way after what had transpired. And at first, we really didn't even have work, because I was so close to where Ground Zero was that we weren't open for many of the days shortly thereafter. And I received a phone call from a friend of mine who currently serves as counselor to Mayor Bloomberg, but at that time he worked for the New York City Corporation Council, and he was assigned to take over the death certificate program. And I thought that sounded like the saddest thing, and just a really unfortunate assignment to get. But then he said, "Do you want to come and volunteer?" And I said, yes. It was almost as if it just kind of spilled out of my mouth, because I realized how important that would be to participate in this very significant project. Because as many people may know, you actually have to wait 3 years following a disappearance without remains of a body to get a death certificate. But they created a very expedited process and involved attorneys to collect the evidence to ensure that indeed this person had perished in the building. So we were assigned to really evaluate the various files that came through. So what I like to talk about is that it was just very emotional to see that a person actually became a file. And so we reviewed these on a regular basis, looking through them, and often we found that we kind of had to tell the stories to each other that we were reading, because you wanted to be able to share these really very tragic stories. Basically, the affidavit had to contain the information that demonstrated what people would never want to demonstrate, the fact that their family member actually was in the building. So they had to talk about their very last conversation with them and how they knew for sure that they would be in the building, and where they worked, and all of the details of how they knew that this person was in the building. And the last conversations were really the most difficult thing to read. And I have said this story before, that I felt as though it was like reading Romeo and Juliet and wishing that that apothecary note would actually make it so that the two wouldn't perish, because I kept thinking, oh, here, this person sounds so interesting, and then you knew that they hadn't survived. And the one that was the most upsetting to me was reading a young girl had said, "Help me, mommy," and her mom had recounted that. And it's just very emotional to me to think about the mother that had to be on the other line, and that was the last thing that she heard her child say, and being unable to help. So now, being a mom myself and thinking about what that mother must have to go through, replaying that very last conversation. And there was another young girl who told her mother that she made it out, and that she was on her way to get out of the building, and she didn't make it. And none of the files had a happy ending. They were all just entirely tragic, and they had become just a number, unfortunately. And it was really difficult. Then I transitioned to another part of the work at the Family Assistance Center, which, by the way, was an incredible thing that just sprung up in a very short period of time. Not only were we there working on the death certificates, but there were people from the UN, there were Red Cross workers. People had all come together at Pier 94 to be able to facilitate this various processes that were needed to help the families. So it was called the Family Assistance Center, and there was a lot that took place at this place. And it was a real place of healing as well. So once I got assigned to the second part of my responsibilities, it was to meet with family members. And that was an incredible experience as well, because the family members really wanted to tell me about their relative and bring that relative to life. So often I spent hours with them while they would describe the things that they loved about their spouse or their child, and it was just incredible. And I felt really honored and privileged to have had that opportunity. And towards the end, there was one particular widow who came in, and she was very, very resistant to actually going through this process, because she felt that it was going to be admitting that her husband had died. And she thought that maybe he was in a hospital and couldn't be found, and she didn't want to have to fill out this paperwork. So they sent her to me thinking that, I would be able to help her through this process. And I did, but she talked about her husband and how much she wished she had had a child with him so she could still see his face, and all of that kind of detail that made it, she really needed hand-holding, because she was so afraid that she was admitting something that she just didn't feel was true yet. So there was that aspect of they needed that kind of closure, and also it's you can't wait endlessly to be able to show that someone has passed away, because there's a lot that has to happen for a person, particularly if they have children, and there's benefits that were going to come to the person, and there's this whole side of them that didn't want to admit, to say they needed to do this process, but they really had to, and it was really crucial for them. So another thing that happened at this Family Assistance Center was that family members were given an urn that was filled with ashes from Ground Zero on one particular day. And I recall that one person told me she was never going to take those ashes because she felt that the hijackers were also in the building, and that, you know, she didn't want those ashes. And I just brought this along because they put a flag on each of them, and they gave them to us as well. So this is a flag that was one of the ones that was put on each of the urns. So there was a lot that happened at this place that I think really was remarkable and shows the generosity of spirit of Americans. And we've had two people talk about the importance of service in the military, but what I wanted to also underscore was the importance of civilian service as well, and the way in which my being able to provide service was so healing for me, and I felt that is such an important thing that we as Americans should value, is being able to provide service to others, and that's the big takeaway message for me from September 11th. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's really fascinating to hear all these stories, and I know all of us have stories of the aftermath of 9/11. One small thing that I want to share, and not in great detail, at the time of 9/11, I was on the faculty of the medical school at West Virginia University, and I was involved in working with people about their psychological well-being, among other things. And I was assigned to work with our Middle Eastern faculty members who were immediately suspect, and many were treated very badly, although they had nothing to do with it. And we lost most of them. They mostly left because they really no longer felt at ease. And yet you can understand that. They understood too. They understood why suddenly the people that would go back and forth and have backyard barbecues with them were now looking at them askance and wondering. But it was a very difficult time for many people in this country, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that there were many dimensions to this story. We're going to start the audience sharing. We have a special guest in our audience today, so I'd like to start, if I could, with Garrett Lindgren.
By chance, I was at METV, I guess, a week or two ago, and did a little thing for Charlie Clapsaddle for 9/11, and I was on my way out, getting in the car, and somebody came out and said, "Charlie, why don't you meet somebody?" And it was Judy, who had just come in, and Charlie had told her a little bit about me, and she asked me if I'd be willing to come here today and share a little bit of my experiences from 9/11. I have to say that everything I heard here today was powerful. There's just so much that went into that day. There's a lot of common threads there. Some of the things that you folks said gave me chills because some of the things I experienced. I'll try to be brief. There's a lot to this, and I'll just try to hit the high notes, I guess. But on the 10th of September, I went into work that morning for an overtime shift. I got assigned to work in a house I normally didn't work in Queens. I normally worked in the rescue company that covered the Bronx and Harlem. And worked that shift. That night I was assigned to work in the rescue company in Queens, where I normally don't work either. But both of the units I worked in that day were in special operations, as I normally would be working in a special operations unit. And it was a very small, close-knit group of people. There's 11,000 New York City firefighters back then, and there were, I think, 300 or so, maybe a little bit more, assigned to special operations. We trained for response to weapons of mass destruction events, terrorism events, hazmat incidents, building collapses, all kinds of specialties. And so I got to catch up with a bunch of these people I hadn't seen in a while. About 11 o'clock at night, sitting in the firehouse in Rescue 4 in Queens, and they had just recently in June had lost 3 members of the company, were killed at a fire. There was an explosion and the building collapsed and killed them. It was referred to as the Father's Day fire because they were killed on Father's Day. and very tragic, very sad event. And I'm sitting there talking to a fireman named Terry Farrell, and he's explaining to me that this pile of bricks that's laying in the apparatus room in the firehouse, they're bricks from this hardware store that had exploded and killed the guys in that fire company, and they brought them back, and he was telling me in great detail about this memorial they were going to build in the firehouse, and they were going to have plaques and have a ceremony and whatever, and you could see that he just was so motivated and dedicated to do this. And that was probably 11:30 at night, and Terry was one of the guys that got killed the next morning. And it just, to me, I have a problem getting past that. He's planning this memorial, this great thing, and he's on it that quickly. And that's part of our job. You know, we oftentimes would lose 10, 11, 12 guys in a year would get killed in the line of duty. But the numbers at 9/11 are just astronomical. 2,752 human beings gone, just like that. The most I had ever lost at an incident, which is still in the history books, was a place called the Happy Land Social Club in the Bronx in the 1980s. I think 87 people were killed. Somebody lit an arson fire while these people were in enjoying themselves. And 87 people, the guys in my firehouse, were in shock for months afterwards, had trouble dealing with it because our function was to, of course, recover all these poor people. 2,752 people, you don't plan for that. You can't imagine it. I still can't imagine it. It's 10 years later. But very briefly, morning came, the relief crews started to come in at the firehouse, and because I wasn't normally assigned to that house, every guy that came in offered to let me go early. And normally you do that. My wife was at work, my kids were in school, I was in no rush. I loved doing my job, and I told each guy that offered me early relief, maybe we'll catch another job before the end of the tour. I'm staying. And this went on until a guy we called Taz came in, and he was a former Marine and a real gung-ho guy, and he just got under my skin and kept pushing me, and I finally said, all right, Taz, you can finish out my shift. It was 25 minutes left or whatever. We changed shifts at 9 in the morning. So we walked out to the rig. I took my gear off the rig. He put his on. We shook hands. I said, I'll see you next time. Have a great tour. And hopped in my car, got on the BQE. There was no traffic. It was a beautiful morning, as everybody says. 9/11 was just a beautiful morning. It was amazingly so. I don't know why, but it was. I was quickly on the Triborough Bridge, and I was listening to a show called Rambling with Gambling on WOR. I used to listen to in the mornings, and that show was on when I was a little kid. And all of a sudden he broke in and said, we have a report there's some kind of fire at the World Trade Center. We don't know the extent of it yet, but we'll let you know as soon as we know more. And I was half asleep, and I looked to my left, and the Trade Center's right there, and I saw what everybody was seeing on live TV, this huge hole in the building, massive, tremendous fire condition, multiple floors. The smoke was already almost over New Jersey. And 5 minutes earlier, I was in the firehouse, and we would know any major event that was going on. Nothing was going on. So there was no explanation for that much devastation that quickly in that type of a fireproof high-rise building. And I could see the hole in the side of the building. My immediate thought was that someone had detonated the bomb up there. You know, they had tried to bring the buildings down in '93, and they weren't successful. Then the plane was mentioned. They said it was a small plane. Obviously, it wasn't a small plane. It was clear that it was something massive. But I started heading for my firehouse, got into the Bronx. The second plane hit. I called my wife, told her what was going on. Got to the firehouse. They were gone already. The guys in my firehouse had been dispatched already. Several of the guys in my company showed up. We jumped in the captain's car. We went to special operations. They wanted to put us in service as a additional rescue company to cover the city. They were afraid there was going to be another attack or more than one attack. And all the 5 rescues were at this event already. So we're on Roosevelt Island now. We're gearing up to be available, and the South Tower collapsed. That immediately changed our scope of operation. We were sent to respond and see what we could do. We were already pretty sure that a lot of people were going to be fatalities, and that a lot of our own people would probably be fatalities. We got tied up in traffic coming out of the Queens Midtown Tunnel, and it probably saved our lives. We had the air horns and sirens going, and it was just gridlock with some really expert driving. The guys that were driving the 2 rigs we had jumped some curbs and got onto the FDR Drive, and the police had the FDR Drive shut. So once we got on the FDR Drive, it was a mad dash. We flew literally down. And as we approached the site, and I talk about getting chills. I still get chills when I think about this. If you picture the old Godzilla movies, when they would try to show panic, they would just show a massive number of people running with their hands over their heads, screaming. Well, that's what we saw heading north on the FDR Drive, was a sea of humanity. It was thousands of people running for their lives, screaming. There was no cars. There was no room for cars. It was all people. And I mean, we were all seasoned veterans. My captain was with us. He had 36 years on the job. He had been through riots and you name it, he had done it. And we all looked at each other and said, oh my God, we just couldn't believe what we were seeing. I mean, it was just overwhelming to us. I called my wife real quick, and in 21 years in the New York City Fire Department, working in the busiest firehouses in the world by choice, I never ever went out the door on a run and thought that I wasn't going to come back. It happened to other guys at fires I was working at, but it just, somebody said earlier that you never envision things happening to you. It's always somebody else. I always felt that I'm well trained, I work with great guys, and we know what we're doing, we're going to be okay. It's dangerous, you get hurt, but we're going to be okay. I called my wife and told her, make sure you know where all our stuff is, get the kids out of school, and tell them I love them. And basically, I said goodbye. I said a lot of us are going to die there today. And I believed it. I truly believed that. Everybody that was with me and myself, we were going to be dead in a little while. We still went. We knew we had to. We knew there were so many innocent people that needed help. And as I say, the only thing that saved me was, first, somebody talked me into leaving the firehouse 20 minutes early, and secondly, we got stuck in traffic for a couple of minutes, and the second tower, the north tower, came down while we were just up the block. And we actually had to stop our vehicle. We couldn't drive because we couldn't see, and we were afraid we were going to start running people over. Got out of the rig, the captain got on his portable radio. Normally, an incident like this, they had already called in 2 fifth alarms and a second alarm, which is more than we've ever had at one incident, ever. And there would be normally communications overload that would be almost impossible to get a word in edgewise on our fireground radios. There was not a sound on the fireground radio. The captain got on the radio. He said, Captain Tizo, calling Rescue 3, which was my normally assigned unit. And nobody answered. And a couple of seconds after that, one of the guys, we were in heavy, heavy smoke and dust, and we couldn't see each other, but one of the guys turned around and said, everybody's dead. I can't even envision, I just can't still take that in. It's 10 years later. How do you picture that every member of the New York City Fire Department that responded to an incident is dead? The most we ever lost in one incident was 12, and that's huge. Plus all these poor civilians, and 23 New York City police officers and 37 Port Authority police officers. It's more than you can ever take in, and I'll cut off after this, but I have to say, you mentioned something before, I think, about psychological work that you did, or, well, I eventually found out from speaking to somebody that they basically assume that everyone that responded to 9/11 has PTSD. I never could fathom myself having PTSD because I was a first responder and I was supposed to be strong and tough and you do what you have to do. And it took me, I guess, almost 8 years to finally realize that I was just really in a dark hole. My poor family kind of walked around me on eggshells for all that time. I wasn't a violent person or anything like that. I just stayed to myself and kind of barely functioned. And finally found somebody great who I went to talk to and who has helped me tremendously. But I don't think that a lot of people are aware of all of the things that came out of 9/11 as far as, well, as far as everything that everyone has said, but also health-wise. Post-traumatic stress is huge, and there's loads of people that aren't even being treated yet that are in denial. But respiratory issues, asthma, chronic bronchitis, chronic sinusitis, cancers of all kinds, gastrointestinal problems. There's over 10,000 people right now, over 10,000 first responders right now from all 50 states who did time at the World Trade Center who are sick in varying degrees. And over 1,000 have died since 9/11, not including all the good people that were killed that day. 1,000 since 9/11 until now have died of what they've determined to be related illnesses. So this thing is still killing people 10 years later. It's destroyed a lot of families. It didn't destroy mine, thank God. I had a strong family, and as I said, I kind of figured out what was going on after a while. But it really made me stop and think when my son, who is now 23 and who is now a firefighter himself here in Florida, said to me, "Hey, Dad, it's great to have you back." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he kind of let me know, "You went to work on September 10th, and you were my baseball coach. And you came home 11 days later. We didn't know who you were." And I'd stayed that way for almost 8 years. So just, I guess my point is, it's bigger than all of us. And there's a lot still going on with it. And a couple of things. I hope we don't let our guard down. There's some things being done now in our country that are kind of showing that the government in some ways is not getting it anymore. There's a pre-position equipment program for first responders that I just found. I worked in it after I retired from the fire department, and I found out that they're completely shutting that down, that FEMA didn't fund it, and it was specifically earmarked for response to terrorism based upon what happened on 9/11. And now it's not funded anymore, and it's going away. So some people are forgetting. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to speak, and God bless all you people and all you went through.
Okay, anyone in the audience who wishes to speak or ask a question, please come to the microphone. And please say your name.
My name is Ann Campagna, and I wrote an essay shortly thereafter. I was near enough that Tuesday, going to my office 4 miles north of the World Trade Center. My daughter was scheduled to be at the nearby World Financial Center at 10. At 8:55, I saw the hordes of people in the lobby staring at the TV. Was it an ad for a dreadful new movie? How eerily real the wounded towers were being depicted. Then the terrible realization, this was not a made-for-TV movie. Everyone was speculating on the cause of the horrific scene being played out before our eyes. Was the first plane smashing into the North Tower a horrible accident? But could the second plane also be a horrible accident? I phoned my daughter to warn her not to take the subway to that area. We all had come to do our jobs, but how could we? What about that important letter that had to go out via overnight mail? How does one turn on a computer and function? Following the announcement of a terrorist attack, a coworker became hysterical. The bridges will be blown up. We'll all die. There was no point in leaving early. Transportation was shut down. So I stayed till the workday, such as it was, ended. I went to the nearest pub. The need to commiserate with fellow New Yorkers overriding my vow never to go to a bar alone. I didn't know any firefighters, as many were at least a generation younger. I learned that 343 had perished, felt a great personal loss, and vowed to attend as many memorial services as possible. I went to 7, 6 empty caskets. Bagpipers played Amazing Grace. solemn processions behind fire engines displaying the helmet number of the fallen hero, huge American flags draped over entire streets. Dennis Mulligan, October 6th, Manuel Del Val, October 13th, Michael Carroll, October 20th, Peter Byfeld, November 3rd, Steve Mercado, November 10th, Robert Nagel, November 17th, and Michael Lynch, December 7th. I remember Dennis Mulligan's dad embracing me, a photo of his son placed on a closed, empty coffin, and FDNY honor guards on both sides. Manuel Del Val's mother, a woman whom I had never met, holding my hand and weeping at the church service for her son. Curtis Sliwa of the Guardian Angels reminiscing about what a great stickball player Steve Mercado was. The note from the Carroll family asking for remembrances of Michael to share with his children. Wynton Marsalis playing a solemn trumpet at the service for Lieutenant Nagel. Countless friends sharing stories of who was the best bowler, who loved to fish, and who had a newborn at home. Afterwards, I write, I knew a firefighter. He'd be there for me 24/7. I had but to dial 3 digits. He'd rush to my side. It was heaven. I knew a firefighter and wanted him all to myself. But if one of his other 8 million friends called, he'd send me one of his brothers. I knew a firefighter. He must have had a wonderful smile. You see, I never met my friend, but only knew him after September 11th. I visited Ground Zero more than once because TV couldn't capture the smells, the pain in people's eyes, the armored vehicles swarming over downtown streets, a window display of new shoes covered in soot. I went to the huge armory on Manhattan's East Side, then Columbus Circle, then subway stations, all strewn with thousands of pictures, flowers, candles, and desperate notes yearning for information about loved ones. I attended a hauntingly beautiful sacred Buddhist fire ceremony for world peace. I dined in an Afghan restaurant, business having drawn to a trickle, and visited a mosque to speak with the imam. Me, a jaded New Yorker who would never take a leaflet handed out on the street, hungrily grabbing a pamphlet entitled Remembrance, Fallen but Not Forgotten. Later that year, I moved to Sarasota, but those 343 firefighters were still with me. Coincidentally, the phone company assigned 343 as the last 3 digits of my new number. After being in New York on 9/11, I didn't sweat the small stuff. It didn't matter if I got disconnected after holding for 10 minutes, or if a shopper with more than 10 items got on the express line. When my daughter's boss once referred to their telephone system being down as a catastrophe, she responded, 9/11 was a catastrophe. A phone system being down temporarily is a minor inconvenience in the scheme of things. Many years ago, the theme of a television program was the 8 million stories in the naked city. Now, everyone has a story about that Tuesday.
Good afternoon. My name is Todd Parrish. I'm State Representative Ray Pilon's legislative aide. But back to September 11th, I was living in Tallahassee, and I was working for Governor Jeb Bush. I was the Legislative Affairs Director at the Department of Children and Families. That morning, I had gone into the office and quickly grabbed some papers and was heading to the airport. I had a CD playing, so my radio wasn't on, and my cell phone rang. It was my sister, and she said, when will you reschedule your trip? And I said, what are you talking about? I'm on my way to the airport. She said, well, the airport's completely shut down. You don't know what's going on? You, of all people, don't know what's going on? And I said, no, I've got this CD playing. You know, she goes, Todd. So I immediately did a U-turn, ran back, back to the office, and the governor had called all of the staff in for an emergency meeting. My role in September 11th started off as the Secretary of the Department of Children and Families at that time, Judge Kathleen Carney, and I were assigned to work with the Department of Children and Families and Health and Human Services in New York. We were looking at our resources, financial resources, staff that could go up and help. Potentially, we were looking at children who had either lost a parent or lost two parents. Looking at mental health issues, even issues such as alcohol abuse and substance abuse from someone who may have been in rehab, going through this situation, wanting the only thing they had to survive was maybe picking up a bottle. And I thought that was the role that we would be having. In my previous life, before this, I had worked for President George Bush Sr. As a personal aide and had done advance for the White House for a few years. When George W. got elected, I did advance for the White House for the President and the Vice President on a domestic basis. Month or so after 9/11, the phone rang one day, and my secretary came in and said, "It's the White House calling." I immediately assumed it was my contact that we were working with in terms of financial resources that the state was giving to New York regarding the relief effort and helping families. And he said, "Todd, the president would like to speak with you." I took the call, and he said, and actually I was on the phone when Sandy came in and said, "The White House is calling." And I almost said, "I'll return the call because I'm working on this relief effort." And she said, "I think you want to take this call." So I picked up the phone and they said, "This is, the president is holding for you." I took the call and he said, "I've spoken to Jeb and I need you in Washington." And I had no earthly idea what I was about to do. A plane was sent down. I went to Washington. Only to find out that the president had put together a peace treaty mission to the Middle East, 14 countries in 17 days that Vice President Cheney was going to lead. And I was assigned to that trip. Immediately to the State Department for briefings, and anytime you travel with the president, vice president, you go through lots of security briefings. Usually the advance team is sent out 2 to 3 weeks ahead of time to put together all the details of the trip. And this time we're being taught everything from hand expressions to making eye contact and who you can and can't make eye contact with, and a little bit about each country that we were going to. And I called my mother, and my father answered the phone. I said, "I need to talk to Mom." And he said, "What have you done now?" And I said, happened to get on the phone at the same time. As he said hello, she said hello. And they had gotten this call quite a few times since the 2000 election, when I said, "Is there any way you could take care of Dottie and Tony, my 2 dogs, for a couple of weeks?" And my mother and father had always said, "Sure, we'd be proud, that exciting. Where are you going this time?" My mother immediately said, "Absolutely not." And Dad said, "Well, sure we will. Not if you're going over there." And how she had any idea that I would be sent to the Middle East, I have no idea. She says, "I don't even remember taking the phone call. I just remember that you'd be over there." Once we went over, I still look back at the different countries we went to. We were in Omar and Tamar, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Bahrain, Israel, and Qatar. We were housed in Qatar, and one of the interesting things there was right after September 11th, the emir in Qatar, who had recently pulled a coup over his father and taken over the country, had talked to President Bush and had opened up a military base to the American troops to spy, and he was sending his troops into other Middle Eastern countries to spy for the United States and give us intelligence. And we had pretty much taken over their entire military base with Americans. So we were housed in Qatar and we're flying to different countries from there. But it was a very shocking time to be traveling around the Middle East, and even in Secret Service vehicles and armed Secret Service vehicles, just knowing that I'm a civilian who had very little role other than to make sure that the Vice President's trip was successful. But the exciting part and the neat part for me, one of the things the Vice President insisted upon, we went on every military base in each of those countries, tent cities, I guess you could call them, and to be able to go into a base and talk to guys from all over the country And some of them would just say, hey, can you call my girlfriend? Can you call my mom? Let her know I'm okay. And to get to call a mother, when you say, this is Todd Parrish, I'm from the White House, and a mother immediately starts crying. And it's like, I'm just called to tell you I met your son. He's doing fantastic. Oh, wow, don't scare me like that.
Yeah.
And, or you would say, I want you to know. But to see their profound love for this country, their determination to defend this country, and that they felt like, although most people were opposed to the war, they felt like they were there for all the right reasons and believed that their mission was the right thing to do. So that was my little part of 9/11. And I still get choked up thinking about traveling through the Middle East and meeting with our military and being a little part of the President and Vice President's mission for this country. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else from the audience? Yes, sir. If you wouldn't mind to, yes.
Like everyone else, I've been deeply moved by the stories and the recollections that we've heard. My name is Ty Reed, and we lived in, my wife and I, in Rowayton, Connecticut, and up until 2003. Rowayton's right on Long Island Sound. And my story leads up to a question for Luke, I think, mainly. You've heard about the weather in several of these accounts. Well, I was down on the beach taking a tennis lesson, and I was supposed to go to work. In fact, I was a little late, and I was playing a little hooky, and my lesson was from 8 to 8:30, and so I wandered over to the beach, which was very close by, and it was a brilliant, clear day, and you could see the towers from Rowayton about 50 miles. Because they were so tall, you could see the upper 50 floors, roughly 40, 50 floors. And the weather was spectacular from that point of view, and at that point, the planes crashed into the towers, one after the other, and smoke arose and billowed out over New Jersey and Long Island, as you've heard. And I've thought about that many, many times, like all of us, with deep, deep sorrow. And I've just this moment, when we hear all these stories, thought of this question, Luke, which is, as a history teacher, former history teacher, I remember how important weather was in so many major events, and there was one in particular which was in our favor on D-Day, when our knowledge of weather was crucial in making that particular day the day for the landing at Normandy. On this day of 9/11, when the weather was so perfect, and hearing today some discussion about the top al-Qaeda leadership has been pretty well decimated, and considering the fact that perhaps, and I want to ask a two-part question, do you think that the al-Qaeda was planning so well with their various efforts, which were very involved plan, that they took into account weather? Were they that brilliant or just lucky? Did you ever come upon anything about that? And do you think that that we are, at this point, we can feel that there's not a similar ability out there in the future to create such a involved plan as that, taking into account the weather?
No, thank you. That's an excellent question. In fact, if you look back to the 9/11 Commission report, the study that was done for the attacks were actually planned years and years in advance. In fact, it was noted in the report actually that when the notice went to Muhammad Atta of the actual day, Muhammad Atta, the hijackers did not know the exact date. of the attack. It was not pre-planned. In fact, it was a phone call that came in, and I think if you've seen any of the National Geographic specials or if you've read the 9/11 Commission, the phone call that came in, and I'm not clear if it came in from KSM to Muhammad Atta or if there was an intermediary in between, but the comment that was made of the day was not even said on the phone. It's going to be September 11th. He actually gave the cryptic message over the phone saying that it was going to be a line with the circle on the top and 2 matchsticks was the code that he used over the phone. So as far as the information I know, it could be possible that they were checking weather reports ahead of time. Could have been almanacs. I've never seen officially in open source traffic or open source information that points to that, but certainly it does point to that there was preparations made in advance and the hijackers did not know until right before the attacks. So they're probable is the best description I would give. Probable that weather was taken into account through a weather report, almanacs, whatever that was. And I'm sorry, the second part of the question was?
Do you think that there's possibly that the al-Qaeda organization is still capable of such a involved plan?
I think that al-Qaeda has been so weakened, especially since Osama bin Laden's death and the sort of what they quote the treasure trove of information that was taken from the compound, and that's evident in the additional drone attacks that happened immediately following. In fact, the #2 lieutenant behind Ayman al-Zawahiri has actually been killed recently, as about a week or so ago. So it looks like they are getting picked off very quickly as a result of the fine. That being said, the FBI just came out with their report saying that the FBI's biggest worry right now is the lone wolf terrorist. That's their biggest concern right now. Someone doing a lone wolf shooting, an individual bombing attack, anything like that, because there's less premeditated intelligence that could be gathered prior to an operation. There's not the sloppiness or the communication of too many cooks in the kitchen, if you will. So I think overall as a whole, al-Qaeda has been weakened. However, now it's become more franchised, and you're certainly starting to see, especially with Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born cleric who has now gone to Yemen and has sort of been the inspiration and is the one who has motivated Major Hassan down in the Fort Hood shootings. It's an individual who's trying to just spread the message to individuals to do these type of acts, which is maybe not as grand of a scale as we would see of 9/11, but certainly these individuals can cause a lot of damage, as we can see just with the shooting or an individual bombing as well. But as a group, no, I don't think as a whole, but certainly I think the individual parts maybe have become more dangerous.
Okay, we have time for one more comment. Dr. Mona Jane.
Thank you. My comment is more after 9/11. It was very tragic. But the first person who got killed in Arizona belonged to my religion, Sikh religion, because we have turban and beard men's, and he was burned inside his gas station. And then I also think about India, what happened in Mumbai. So what can we do? I know we all are trying on our own. We have the different faiths getting together and saying we should have peace around the world and others. But what can we do as a community? Even now, that's my question. I know each one of you have done a great job and have been doing it. But I think as a community, we need to come out with more awareness and education.
I think that's a great question for all of us to reflect upon. I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that question, but it's essentially a question, it's a rhetorical question to all people, is how do we ever get back to peace? And one of the strongest memories I have is before we actually did go to war, watching television one night and thinking, this may be the last time in my lifetime that I experience my country at peace. It's a very frightening thought. And the one thing that I know is that peace starts inside each person, and that's where it's very sorely lacking in many parts of the world, including here. Are there any final comments from the panel, and then we'll close?
Well, I would just like to say that on that same note as you were mentioning, I often try to go back to the moments in 9/11, that day before, my mother's visit, the plans for the day, sort of the innocence lost. And you try to remember that. I try to remember what it felt like to not have this heavy heart, that no matter how much you try to draw from it some source of strength and also wisdom to move forward smarter, better, as both an individual and as a community, but what it was like to live without that. And I have interviewed and done stories on people through the years who operated and lived, who used this as a license to expand their ignorance and their discrimination, and to shed light on not only how they're about that ignorance, but also the organizations out there trying to educate others, the groups trying to come together. And I think that's very important. As a journalist, I would try to highlight that, but again, that was just a small window of opportunity for me to do that. It's important for us to continue that momentum. I would agree that there's a lot of work still to be done there, because unfortunately, in times of tragedy, it gives those who already live in a world filled with hate, often due to nothing other than their own making, license to take that and run. And so it's our job as a community to come together to make sure that that doesn't spread as a result of fear. And so I would agree that there's a lot of work still to be done there. And it can be as simple as, it can be a community event, but a lot of what I found was neighbor to neighbor, church to church, you know, block party to block party, teacher to teacher. And that's how it starts, small steps that can really generate so much good and so much positive environment, because it's living together positively that I think is what gives us the greatest strength. At least that's what I would found when I would try to drill down to those individual stories. So I would say there is still a lot of work to be done there. I agree.
Thank you very much. Well, I want to thank you all very much for coming. We do have a reception following. Sometimes if you care to talk to any of the panelists or continue to share stories with each other. I want to thank our panel. You were all wonderful. The stories were heartfelt and so touching. And please enjoy some wine and refreshments outside. Thank you very much.